This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for both the queen and the king's bishop, facilitating rapid development and potential early piece activity. This move, 1. c5, initiates the Sicilian defense, Black's most popular and theoretically rich response to 1. e4, immediately creating an asymmetrical pawn structure and fighting for central control with a flank pawn. Developing the knight to f3 is a principal move in the Sicilian defense, preparing to control the center and support a subsequent d4 pawn push, aiming to challenge Black's asymmetrical pawn structure. This move transitions into the French defense, preparing to control central squares with the d-pawn and challenging White's central space. This move initiates the main line of the French defense, immediately challenging Black's central pawn structure and aiming to open lines for White's pieces. This capture opens the c-file, creating immediate dynamic possibilities and leading into the main lines of the advance variation of the French defense. This move, recapturing the pawn, establishes White's central pawn majority and opens lines for development, typically leading into variations of the open Sicilian or the closed Sicilian if White chooses to avoid immediate pawn tension. This move, nc6, develops a knight towards the center and supports the d5 pawn advance, a key thematic idea in this variation of the open Sicilian. This move continues the development of White's pieces, reinforcing the central knight on d4 and preparing for further pawn expansion or piece activity, while entering a standard variation of the Alpine Sicilian. This move, 5, qc7, develops the queen, connects the rooks for later, and supports a potential nf6 push, all while maintaining flexibility. This move develops the bishop to a useful square, preparing to castle kingside and supporting the central pawn structure. This move, a6, is a prophylactic maneuver, preparing to potentially play b5 to gain queenside space and prevent White's knight from comfortably occupying c4 or b5 in future exchanges. Castling kingside is a logical prophylactic measure in this Sicilian Alpine variation, securing the king and preparing to develop the rook to a more active central file. This move prepares to challenge White's queenside pawn structure and gain space with the pawn advance, a typical theme in certain Sicilian setups. By exchanging knights, White aims to disrupt Black's pawn structure on the queenside and potentially gain a space advantage. This move, dxc6, resolves the immediate tension in the center and importantly, allows Black to develop their light-squared bishop to a more active diagonal after bd6. This move challenges Black's queenside pawn structure by threatening to create an isolated c-pawn, aiming to exploit the weakened d6 pawn and open lines for White's pieces. This move prepares to challenge White's aggressive pawn push on the queenside by developing the rook to an active square, aiming to control the b-file and potentially support a queenside expansion. This move f4 aims to expand White's central pawn control, create attacking chances on the kingside, and potentially prepare to challenge Black's pawn chain or open lines for the rook. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to challenge White's control of the d4 square and potentially support a queenside pawn advance. This move prepares to connect the rooks by freeing the h1 square for the rook and provides an escape route for the king should central play open up. This move develops the rook to a more active central file, directly challenging White's control of the d-file and preparing for potential pawn breaks or piece activity on that side of the board. This move, k1, prepares to reinforce the central pawn structure by supporting the d4 pawn and potentially rerouting the queen to a more active square on the kingside or to support a central pawn push. This move prepares to castle kingside, completing development and safeguarding the king while simultaneously freeing the d8 square for potential future piece activity. This move prepares to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control key central squares and potentially support a kingside attack. This move aggressively pushes the pawn to gain space on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's development and potentially create weaknesses in the pawn structure, while also preparing to challenge the now exposed c3 knight. This move retraces the knight, likely to reposition it to a more active square like c3 or d2, aiming to support the pawn push or contest the d-file after black's structure potentially weakens. Black challenges white's knight's retreat by advancing the c-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines for the bishop on b7. This move repositions the knight to a more flexible square, potentially preparing to support a central pawn advance or redeploy to the kingside for defense or attack, while also opening lines for other pieces. This move prepares to challenge white's central control and develop the kingside, potentially targeting the d4 square and creating more dynamic play on the queenside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control the central squares and potentially support a kingside advance while preparing to contest the c-file. Castling kingside finally brings the king to safety and connects the rooks, completing black's development while preparing for a potential central pawn push or queenside play. This move prepares to expand on the queenside by supporting the b4 pawn and potentially opening a file with the eventual b4-b5 advance. This move aims to solidify the queenside pawn structure and prevent white from exploiting the a-file after potential pawn advances, though it also somewhat restricts the activity of black's queenside pieces. This move shifts the queen to a more active diagonal, potentially targeting weaknesses on the kingside and preparing to support pawn pushes like g4. This move prepares to challenge white's central control and potentially create a kingside pawn storm by freeing the f-pawn for advance, aiming to open lines for black's pieces. This pawn thrust challenges black's knight on f6, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and disrupt black's pawn structure by potentially creating an isolated d-pawn for black if the knight retreats to e8 or d7. This move initiates a knight maneuver to the kingside, aiming to exploit the weakened g6 pawn and potentially create attacking chances after white's pawn advances. The queen repositions to f2, a common square in this pawn structure, to prepare for a potential kingside pawn storm and to support the e5 pawn. The knight repositions to g7 to join the kingside defense and potentially eye the f5 square, supporting a more robust pawn structure against white's queenside pressure. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to support the pawn push e5 and potentially control d6, while also preparing for further pawn breaks or piece transfers. The knight repositions to f5 to challenge white's active bishop on e3 and prepare for potential pawn breaks in the center or queenside. This move activates the rook to an open file, aiming to control the central d-file and support potential pawn advances or piece activity on the queenside. This move repositions the king to a safer square away from the central files and potential enemy activity on the kingside. The move kg1 is a prophylactic maneuver, common in many openings, to secure the king from potential discovered attacks or checks along the g1-a7 diagonal that could arise after black advances their pawns on the queenside or center. This exchange simplifies the position, clarifying the central pawn structure and potentially opening lines for white's pieces towards the kingside. With the black knight having just exchanged on e3, white recaptures with the queen to centralize it, regain pawn symmetry, and prepare to contest the d-file, simultaneously unblocking the bishop on d3. The rook aggressively occupies the semi-open d-file, creating immediate pressure on white's queenside and potentially preparing for future breakthroughs or exchanges. With the black rook firmly established on d4, it's prudent to improve the king's shelter and prepare for potential pawn breaks or piece activity by bringing the king back to a more secure square. This move aims to centralize the queen and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the queenside, while also adding defensive support to the d4 pawn. This move prepares to reinforce the central pawn push with f5, aiming to dislodge black's knight from e3 and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside. This move activates the rook on the open d-file, challenging white's control and preparing to potentially double rooks or support a pawn push on the queenside. This move prepares to double rooks on the d-file, aiming to increase pressure on black's d4 pawn and potentially open lines for attack. This move aggressively challenges white's center, aiming to exploit the slightly less developed queenside and create dynamic play by opening lines on the queenside. This pawn capture on c4 opens the b-file for your rooks and aims to challenge black's control of the center, potentially creating weaknesses in their pawn structure. This move boldly challenges white's central pawn majority and threatens to disrupt white's coordination by creating an open queen file. This move targets the vulnerable d6 square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially open lines for white's pieces towards the black king. This move sacrifices the rook to open the d-file and create complications, hoping to exploit white's slightly uncoordinated pieces after the pawn push. This pawn capture opens the e-file and challenges black's centralized knight, forcing a decision about its future placement and potentially creating attacking opportunities for white along the open file. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the weakened light squares on white's queenside and preparing to contest the central files. This move initiates a critical pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to pry open lines for white's rook and queen against black's castled king, exploiting the potential weakness created by black's d6 pawn. This move recaptures the pawn, aiming to open the e-file for counterplay and potentially activate the bishop on f6, while challenging white's advanced pawns. This move, k8, aims to exploit the open e-file and exert pressure on black's king, while also preparing to support a potential pawn advance on the kingside or reinforce the defense of white's own king. Black accepts the pawn sacrifice with the exchange of queens, aiming to simplify the position into an endgame where their connected passed pawns on the queenside might become a significant advantage. With the rook now centralized on the 8th rank, white aims to exploit the weakened kingside and potentially target the remaining pawn weaknesses on black's queenside. The rook captures the pawn on d6, initiating a tactical sequence that forces simplification and leads to a rook endgame where black aims to utilize their extra pawn on the queenside. The rook repositions to b8, aiming to support the advancement of the a-pawn and potentially control the b-file. Black's move reinforces the bishop's control over the d5 square, preparing to contest the open file with the rook. Re1 aims to support the advanced e-pawn, potentially creating a passed pawn or initiating an attack on the weakened kingside. This pawn push aims to gain space on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn, disrupting white's rook on b8 and opening lines for black's pieces. This move aggressively challenges black's pawn chain, aiming to open lines and create a passed pawn on the c-file. This move aims to contest the central open file and potentially create counterplay for black's rook on the fourth rank, while also defending the d6 pawn. This move sacrifices the rook to win material, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create winning endgame advantages. This move, bc3, aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting the pawn on a4 and preparing for a coordinated attack on white's queenside. This move secures the white rook on the b-file, supporting the advanced b4 pawn and preparing to contest the crucial open c-file should black's bishop be dislodged. Black's move a3 aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside by sacrificing material for activity, though it leaves the queenside pawn structure vulnerable. This move activates the rook, bringing it into the active play on the sixth rank where it supports the pawn advance and potentially creates threats against black's kingside.